that one man or one woman's terrorist is another's freedom fighter, and we've had many examples of that, whether it's Nelson Mandela or indeed more recently perhaps in Northern Ireland, some of the players there. I think it's also worth pointing out that, of course, different countries, even within Europe, have a very different approach to dealing with some of these issues. And I have watched with some amazement how the French have been responding. The idea that tackling issues around Islam it should involve requiring women on beaches to remove their burkinis, I think is a very strange approach, which I hope we won't see replicated in the United Kingdom. I'd now like to move on to our final speaker of this particular session, and it's a great pleasure to ask Dr. Afzal Ashraf to speak to us, and again I'll allow him to introduce himself in more detail should he wish to do so.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honour and a privilege to be here, albeit a daunting honour for two reasons. First of all, I have been studying terrorism and extremism since 1998, 18 years, over which time I've looked at the ideologies, the messages and the actions of extremists. I have spoken to them, I've been targeted by them, and worse still, I've seen the horrors of their actions on babies and young people. And so, in the somewhat mean time that my honourable friend from not too far away in South London is going to give me, I find it difficult to do this topic justice. The second reason I feel daunted is that I'm a man and not a woman, and so I cannot do more than one thing at a time. I was asked to provide a script to help the interpreters. I've done that, and in order for me to remain on the script and not confuse them, I will now have to sit down and read it. That means reading and speaking at the same time, which is daunting. So if I may, I shall start. The question that is confronting us today is what role can religious leadership play in confronting extremism? The simple answer to that is that religious leaders should emphasize the commonality of humanity, tolerance, and the importance of empathy and social justice, as we've eloquently heard from the esteemed speakers so far. In particular, where extremists misuse scripture to justify their violent actions, religious leaders have a duty to highlight the errors of these interpretations. Now, that is the simple answer, and just about every religious leader in the world, including the Pope, the Dalai Lama, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, and here in London, the Caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, a counterweight to the Caliph of Daesh, have all done so to a degree or other. Now, despite their noble efforts, there has been, I think you will agree, relatively little improvement. To understand why, I hope we need to ask some basic questions. One of those is, what is the relationship between religion and politics? And what is the difference between religion and politics? And how do we actually get religious extremism? And what role does religion play in extremist ideologies? Having addressed those, perhaps we go some way to answering the question what religious leaders should actually do. Now, political systems have essentially two components. Who exercises power and the value framework within which that power is exercised. In most cases, that value framework comes from religion or the religious heritage of the nations involved. Western liberal democracies, such as here in Europe and in North America, rely on the Judeo-Christian value system for many of their principles and laws. So religion and politics are linked through power and values. The difference between religion and politics, in my humble assessment, is that religion aspires people to high principles. Any compromise in those principles can be seen as a compromise in faith. Politics, on the other hand, necessitates pragmatism, which in turn requires compromise. And that is why in systems that are primarily political, pragmatism is required to work with others and can usually easily be achieved with people of different outlooks and values. In systems that are led by religious leaders, decisions made for pragmatic reasons are problematic because they can be seen as a weakness in the faith that these leaders represent. And very often in history we see that such systems lead to extremist offshoots. Now, that is not the only way that extremism arises in religions. Scholars who have studied this phenomenon tell us that people develop extremist interpretations of religion when they experience social and political crises. And I've confirmed that hypothesis by studying the Dutch Reformed Church's support for apartheid, development of the Hindutva ideology, and the development of Islamism, for example. In such circumstances, social and political grievances are interpreted as threats to identity and values of believers, and religion is reinterpreted to confront those perceived as responsible for the threat. In so doing, religious extremist ideologies primarily serve two purposes. They, on one hand, mobilize followers around their religious identity against the perceived threat, and secondly, they provide an ethical justification for violence over others and control over others. So what can religious leaders do to confront extremism? Firstly, most importantly, they must maintain a separation from power. They need to avoid having power or influencing those who have power. But they should influence positively the debate on the values by which power is exercised. In particular, the values universal to all major religions of peace through the exercise of absolute justice, beneficence, and altruistic love. We are today being asked to offer policies that might be effective in countering extremism. Many policies are needed, and indeed many policies exist. But if these policies do not directly link to the religious principles I've mentioned, then they risk being ineffective. For example, we must encourage governments to think more critically about the current fashion in international relations of enforced regime change, where the price of change is paid for by the lives of innocent citizens. We have a bizarre situation where, in order to liberate people from the oppression of dictators, many times more innocent people die during and following the liberation than if the oppression of those dictators continued. Absolute justice requires that all people are equal before the law. That is not just within the country, but also between countries. Now, I think all of the countries represented here today will not arm, encourage, or in any way support vigilante groups to fight crime in their countries, no matter how well-meaning they may be. We know that eventually these groups are likely to threaten the very peace and security that they aim to protect. We only grant such powers to police and other forces who work within the framework of the rule of law. Why then do we encourage, arm, and support groups in other countries? How many examples are there in recent times of such groups transitioning to peaceful governance? Not many, but there are many examples of such groups becoming extremists, leading to extremism. Indeed, most of the prominent extremist groups have benefited from either direct or indirect support to develop their reigns of terror. So while religious leaders should continue to progress interfaith dialogue, encourage critical and accurate study of their scriptures, they should also focus on understanding that it is both local and global social and political crises that lead to extremism. They should advise and guide political leaders on how to work towards peace through universal justice, through the expression of beneficence, and through the aspiration of altruistic love. That requires that the structures of international law and cooperation, imperfect as they currently are upheld and strengthened rather than being ignored and weakened. Ladies and gentlemen, in the 1.5 minutes extra that I've managed to steal from the chairman, that is all that I have to say.